When you need someone to talk to and you don't know what to do, call us 4400. When you're feeling all alone and they turn their back on you, call us 4400. Call us 4400. Call us 4400. Call us.
Welcome to the Kind Counseling Podcast with your host, Cammie Roberts. I just want to welcome everyone to our podcast today. And for those of you who don't know, Kind Counseling is a family owned and run mental health practice where our goal is to give hope to the hopeless through mental health empowerment and spiritual insight. We also provide family counseling, couples counseling, group counseling for teens, men, women, and individuals. Okay, we're located 1300 Flatbush Avenue near the Flatbush Junction. And basically, our podcast is here to bring information to our clients and the public about relevant mental health issues in the Black and Caribbean community. And today, we're going to discuss the George Floyd situation from a legal perspective to give people insight into what this case is really about. Okay, and having said that, I've been talking to a lot of my clients this week, and people are outraged and devastated by the event of George Floyd's murder. I thought I would bring a special guest in today who can give us a lot of insight into this situation. And today we're going to bring in Mr. Gregory Ajosi. He's a graduate of Brooklyn College, CUNY, and Fordham University Law School. He's a criminal defense attorney with over 10 years experience practicing in New York criminal and Supreme Courts. Prior to becoming an attorney, he was a member of the New York City Police Department for over 15 years, retiring with the rank of sergeant. Gregory is also a proud veteran of the United States Marine Corps and an avid fitness enthusiast. So let's welcome Mr. Ajosi to the show today. All right. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Cammie. How are you?
All right, I'm doing great, man. It's hot outside and it's hot in the streets, and people want to know what's going on in this situation. Now, as a defense attorney, tell the people, what does it mean for Officer Chauvin, I hope I'm saying his name right, to be charged with second-degree murder? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, thank you for having me and giving me an opportunity to participate in the work that Kind Counseling is doing. Your company is providing a vital service to the Black community, given that we've suffered under years of trauma, and there's so many of us in our community walking around with undiagnosed trauma, undiagnosed post-traumatic stress, as a result of the systemic racism and discrimination we face in this society, and the daily microaggressions that are meted out on us as we try to go about our daily lives. So
Right.
Thank you very much for the work you guys are doing. The incident involving George Floyd took place in the state of Minnesota, in the city of Minneapolis. So the Minnesota Penal Code is what's controlling, and former Officer Chauvin, because he was fired by the police chief and mayor, he's currently he's facing charges of murder in the second degree in the state of Minnesota. And I'm just going to read from the statute directly to avoid paraphrasing it incorrectly. But subdivision 1 of in murder in the second degree in the state of Minnesota has 2 subdivisions, 1 and 2. And the first is intentional murder. Okay. And it says, whoever does either of the following is guilty of murder in the second degree and may be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 40 years. Yeah. And it's causes the death of a human being with intent to affect the death of that person or another, but without premeditation, And the second clause of subdivision 1 has to do with a drive-by shooting, which is not relevant for our purposes here. But again, firstly, subdivision 1 intentional murder is when a person causes the death of another person with the intent to cause the death of that person, but without premeditation, meaning he hasn't planned it out beforehand or thought about it beforehand. And there's a legal term called malice of forethought. When you say to yourself, I'm going to kill someone and I'm going to kill that person, and you lay in ambush for them, or you lay in wait for them, and then when they walk by, you jump out and kill them. Subdivision 2 of murder in the second degree encompasses unintentional murder.
Okay.
And it says whoever does either of the following is guilty of unintentional murder in the second degree and may be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 40 years. And it says, again, it's questionable whether it's applicable here, but it's clause 1 is causes the death of a human being without intent to affect the death of any person while committing or attempting to commit a felony offense other than criminal sexual conduct in the first or second degree with force or violence or a drive-by shooting. So that's what's called in New York State felony murder. If in the course of committing a felony you cause someone's death, then you get charged with you get charged with murder in second degree in Minnesota. Now, interestingly, when I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, when former officer Chauvin was initially charged, when he was first charged,
right,
they charged him with murder in the third degree. And murder in the third degree, it's almost equivalent to manslaughter here in New York State. And the statute reads, whoever, without intent to affect the death of any person, causes the death of another person by perpetrating an act eminently dangerous to others and evincing a depraved mind without regard for human life, is guilty of murder in the third degree and may be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 25 years. So, it seems to me that was the statute to charge Chauvin with, which has the greater likelihood of a conviction. But thankfully, usually when someone is charged with a high crime, there's something called lesser included, meaning that the conduct in murder in the third degree is encompassed and included in the conduct for murder in the second degree. So a jury would have the option of finding him not guilty. Even if they found him not guilty of the higher count, they could still find him guilty of the lesser included.
So I have a question. So the higher the degree of the charge, like meaning from going from third to second degree, this is a harder case to get a conviction with?
No, because the burden of proof remains the same no matter what the charges are. The prosecutor has to prove the person's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. I guess the difficulty, well, I don't want to say difficulty, it's just that when someone is convicted, when someone is brought to trial and they're facing charges, the prosecutor has to prove each element of the offense. So for example, murder in the second degree would in Minnesota requires that the prosecutor prove that the perpetrator or the accused caused the death of a human being, and that he had the intent to cause the death of that person. So mindset comes into play. You have to show, so the defense argument would be Mr. Floyd died, but it wasn't Chauvin's intent to kill him. And so therefore there was no intent there. That their argument would be that all the elements of this statute have not been satisfied, and therefore he's not guilty of this particular statute. That's what the defense argument would be.
So now, given the history of police officers and and black victims. Um, what's the likelihood of him being convicted in this situation? Even if, I'm not sure if you can answer that, but what's the likelihood considering the history?
Well, in looking at it in legal terms, there's a 50-50 chance that he'll be convicted because the jury can come down with guilty or not guilty. So it's one of two outcomes. There's everything hinges on the prosecution, the evidence that they have available to them. If they charge a crime that the evidence will support a conviction. So there are so many things so many moving parts and so many things that are going on behind the scenes that it would be reckless to try to handicap the likelihood of a conviction or not.
Well, part of why I asked that is because it seems as though everyone thinks it's a foregone conclusion that this officer, or the four officers, because there's video, that they're going to be convicted and put away for, I don't know, 20, 25 years, what have you. So would you caution people in the black community to get their hopes up?
Well, I don't, the court of public opinion is very, very different from a court of law. And in our society, people have very short attention spans. Certainly an argument can be made that critical thinking skills are not what they should be in the society at large. And so, we're accustomed to quick and easy and oversimplified outcomes. And again, prosecuting a capital case is a very complex, complicated endeavor, and the outcome is not guaranteed. And it's an examination of the conduct takes place through a lens of the law, and the rules of evidence, and a statute and case law. So in order, one would have to be familiar and aware with all those different factors. What's the case law? What's the precedent? What does the statute say? What is the evidence? What are the witnesses going to testify? So it's such a large and complex picture, most of which is out of the sight of the public, that it's easy to jump to conclusions and think things will hash out one way and be completely wrong because you're not privy to all of the evidence, or you're not knowledgeable about the law or criminal procedure.
Well, what would I'm not too familiar with that, but what would make a capital case more complicated than, say, a regular case? Like, why would this case be different?
Well, because the courts have ruled from the Supreme Court on down that police officers are given much deference in the performance of their duties, because the state gives a police officer the authority to take your liberty, to seize your person, to seize your effects, your goods, and your property, and ultimately to take your life under certain circumstances. And so police officers are given great deference. So you see, when police officers use force to restrain a person, when they use deadly physical force, they're given a lot of deference. It's almost as if a police officer is simply, if he can articulate that he felt that his life was in danger, that he had a reasonable fear of imminent serious physical injury or death, then courts have been reluctant to second guess that. Juries have been reluctant to second guess that. And so that's what makes for this spate of police officers killing people or seriously injuring people in the course of their duty, and not being convicted once they're charged and the matter goes to trial.
Well, Yeah, just switching gears for 1 second. Obviously, most of us saw the video that transpired in Minneapolis, and I think the obvious question is, how come one of the officers, specifically the Asian one, how come he didn't say, well, hey, you're hurting this guy, like, get off of him, or why is it so hard for police officers to hold each other accountable as
Well,
a police officer?
I don't know what was going through that officer's mind, so I wouldn't speculate. It could be something as simple as I didn't see, I didn't know. I couldn't tell you. What I do know from being a former officer is that the police department is a closed, insular organization, and you literally depend on your coworkers daily to safeguard your back, and so there's great effort not to alienate your coworkers, and more so, it's more than just a job. It's a position, a career that fosters its own culture and its own mindset, and so it's like a fraternity almost, a secret fraternity, a secret club, and so members are generally very, very hesitant to cross, their colleagues, to break tradition, to break custom, and so that lends it towards a blue wall of silence. People keeping quiet, people knowing that others are doing wrong, but keeping their mouths shut because they're more concerned about being labeled a rat, a snitch, and being alienated by their peers than they are doing what's right.
So in your experience, what happens to an officer, whether it's a situation like this or another one, where they confront other officers for not upholding the law or abusing the law? Like, what happens in those situations?
Well, every situation is different. I mean, it could range from, pushing and shoving because one officer's bad behavior causes another officer to get in trouble. I mean, the concern might not necessarily be for the public, but for one's own self-interest. Like, if I'm working with you and you do something wrong, I'm going to get in trouble. And so, don't do that. Or it could be, someone who takes a higher moral stance that what you did or what you're doing is wrong. Don't do it. And but in terms of dealing with it, it could be something as simple as, I'm not working with you anymore. Again, because officers are very, very hesitant to tell on each other, and that's why one of the reforms that's been proposed in the wake of this, terrible tragedy is sanctioning officers, making them criminally liable if they observe wrongdoing by their peers and do not report it.
I mean, from a public perspective, when we look at this situation, it seems almost like a simple thing of, well, why don't you just stop the other guy, or why don't you report the guy, or is it a really tense atmosphere? I mean, when something like that happens, like I said, to the public, it just seems like a no-brainer almost.
Well, I mean, again, it's an insular group of people. They're almost, for want of a better word, they're in battle. They're in a physical maybe not so much this instance, with Mr. Floyd. I mean, I'm sure that their attorneys are going to argue that it was an altercation, a confrontation, and so if one officer or a number of officers are involved in a physical confrontation, there might be some hesitancy on the part of the others to intervene in a manner that could be construed as aiding the accused person over your partner. I mean, it's very complex, and it's hard to speculate, because you're dealing with human beings. You don't know what's going on in their minds. You don't know what the lens through which they see people and see their job and whatnot. I mean, afterwards, we can certainly say it doesn't appear that the other officers were concerned about Mr. Floyd's well-being. Were they afraid of Officer Chauvin? I mean, since then it's come out that two of the officers were rookies. They had recently completed their training, and it was just their first couple of shifts out on working by themselves. Okay. And that the Officer Chauvin was very much senior to them, so they would defer to him because of his experience. So it could be a matter of, they're new, they're green, they're rookies, and they're deferring to this, supposedly experienced officer who's well versed in policing and what to do in different situations.
Okay. So obviously from this situation, we see the fallout is, we have a lot of riots and protests, like we're seeing in America, and around the world, obviously. And as I speak to my clients, some of them have gone to protests. You look at it on television, it's predominantly about white people. So what should we make of this?
Well, I think that for years and years and years and years, people of color, Black people specifically, have openly questioned the credibility of police officers because they have been the victims of police officers taking action and then making false and inaccurate statements about what actually occurred, and they weren't believed. And now with these videos that have been circulated and gone viral, people are seeing, wow, there's merit to what minorities have been saying for years, that police officers in their communities abuse them and brutalize them and then lie about what happened. I think, from a mental health standpoint, sometimes it's a coping mechanism, in the sense that when a person of color says the police officer planted drugs on me, and then other people were saying, why would a police officer plant drugs on you? Why would a cop do that? Because they can't fathom that something like that would happen. When they hear that the police officer used force to affect them, and the person arrested said, I didn't do nothing, the cop just punched me in the face. And the white people invariably say, why would they do that? Or even some Black people would say, well, that guy must have done something, because the alternative is too harsh and terrible to consider, that people who are employed by the state to protect and serve are abusing their authority willy-nilly. Right. And as a coping mechanism, we just, there's a tendency to bend over backwards to justify the actions of the police. And now the emperor is being revealed as having no clothes. We're seeing these video after video after video that contradicts what's in the report. That incident in Buffalo where the elderly man was, aggressively pushed by the police officers and fell to the ground, striking his head. And, they wrote on the report that he tripped and fell.
Right.
And had there not been a videotape to show otherwise, those officers who've just been both arrested and charged with felony assault, no one would be none the wiser. But I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing a greater participation by other members of the community in response to these incidents.
Okay, all right. So now there's a scene in the movie Malcolm X, Spike Lee's movie, where I don't know if you've seen the movie, where a white woman walks up to Malcolm X. I think he was giving a lecture at Harvard or was it some Ivy League?
Yes.
And she says, "What can white people do to help?" And he says, "Nothing." And then he walks away. And the woman looks so sad, like, And what are your thoughts about white people helping?
Well, I think that we didn't create, people of color didn't create this problem. It's, it's a problem for them to solve. And it's exhausting as a Black person to try to explain systemic racism to white people who have benefited from it all their lives, to to have to explain white privilege to white people who've benefited from it all their lives. To explain to white people who would say that they've never owned a slave, their ancestors never owned slaves, but every day they benefit from a system that was built on slavery and the subjugation and oppression of Black people. And so it's exhausting, and it's for them to stop talking and do something about it. When they have roles as gatekeepers in human resources departments and corporations across America, they have roles as gatekeepers in admissions officers in colleges and universities and private secondary schools and exclusive secondary schools across the country.
Right.
They have their loan officers in banks, their triage nurses in ERs, in medical emergency rooms, hospital emergency rooms. They occupy all positions within the socioeconomic strata, yet a person of color can run up against a roadblock that will diminish his or her life or negatively impact the trajectory of his life. And that's when they have to start utilizing their privilege and fight against their bias, their unconscious biases, their implicit biases, and do the opposite of what the bent of their heart might tell them to do, and do what's right rather than what's easy.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that brings us to the Drew Brees situation in New Orleans. I'm sure you're familiar. The quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, where 4 years ago he was a hero for telling people that he'd never kneel for the national anthem, and now he's been basically dragged on social media for saying the same thing. So and then he apologizes the next day. So it's kind of, you don't know what to believe. Like, is this guy, he suddenly got a change of heart, overnight, or was it public pressure, or what?
Well, I think you have to just clarify. He made those statements some years ago when Colin Kaepernick began his silent, peaceful protest to draw attention to police brutality in the United States of America. And Colin Kaepernick, at that time, who was the quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, took a knee during the playing of the national anthem before games. And he was widely vilified from everyone from the president on down as being un-American and disrespecting the troops, disrespecting the military, which was an illogical assertion on so many different levels. But just earlier this week, a writer, a journalist for Yahoo News, in the course of an interview with Drew Brees, brought up the topic about taking a knee, and Drew Brees reiterated that he felt it was disrespectful to the flag. In the midst of all these protests against police brutality, he said that. Right. And so he walked it back a couple of days later. He apologized. And now his fans, many, not all, of course, but many white Americans who agree with the stance that to take a knee during the national anthem is somehow disrespectful to the military. They're apoplectic and angry at him for apologizing and for saying that he's making an effort to listen to his teammates in the Black community and then to learn why that assertion is wrong.
Well, it's obviously, as a former Marine, would you say that this is offensive?
Absolutely not. This nation was founded on protest. The founding fathers protested British rule over the colonies, and that protests culminated in violence with armed insurrection and revolution. So, the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights guarantees us the right to freedom of expression. So taking a knee doesn't violate the Constitution. Protest is enshrined in the Constitution. And the United States military takes an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. So the United States military is defending and upholding the right to protest, which includes taking a knee during the playing of the national anthem.
Okay, all right. So obviously in these situations we need lawyers that are, concerned about young black men or just, people in the black community in general. And that's part of what you do. So tell us a little bit about your practice, a little bit about what you do as a defense attorney. Um, what kind of services do you offer?
Well, I'm a criminal defense attorney. I mean, I do, there are other areas of the law, family law, that I get involved in, but primarily my calling is to advocate for people who have been arrested and charged with crimes by the state, and representing them in court and advocating for them, and trying to get them out from under the burden, or the often unjust and heavy burden that the state, the heavy burden of a sanction that the state tries to mete out upon them, which more often than not is wildly disproportionate when compared to the conduct for which they're charged. So like I said, I represent people in court. I represent them in fighting criminal charges, whether I represent them in family court. I represent them in school suspension hearings. I represent them in forums where the consequences can have far-reaching negative effects on not only on their lives, but the lives of their children or future children and families, because criminal conviction, expulsion from school because of alleged conduct that's hurtful or harmful to another person, an order of protection being lodged against you in family court, being the subject of having a child removed from you. These are things that going forward in your life can negatively affect your ability to get a job, your ability to a home, to get a loan, to rent an apartment, to gain admission to an institution of higher learning, and to get a professional license. So to adjust your status as a legal permanent resident, to get U.S. citizenship. These things, it could result in deportation. Being charged criminally has so many, a criminal conviction has collateral consequences that people are not aware of. And so it's very important to have an attorney who advocates for you, who isn't just thinking about the case in front of him, but he's thinking of a ripple effect. How is this case going to affect other areas of your life and of your family's life?
Okay. Now, for anyone listening, if they wanted to contact you, how could they reach you?
Well, I'm an attorney. I have a law practice. It's the law office of Gregory O. Ajosi, PC, which stands for Professional Corporation. My telephone number is 718-301-6814, 718-301-6814. I have a website that details my biography and my office address, telephone number, email, and my website is www.thelawofficeofgregoryajosi.com. And my name is spelled Gregory, Gregory, Ajosi, Ajose. So it's www.thelawofficeofgregoryajosi.com.
All right. Okay. So listen, man. Any last comments before we get out of here, man? Anything you want to add? Anything you want to say before we go?
Well, one thing that I always tell people, friends, family, acquaintances, if you're stopped by the police, just give your name, your address, your date of birth, and ask for a lawyer. Because these people get into these long conversations with police officers, thinking that they can talk their way out of a situation, that it's just a misunderstanding, and they end up talking themselves into a hole. You have the most important right that you have when you're interacting with police officers is your right to remain silent. And it doesn't mean to be disrespectful. It doesn't mean to curse them out. It just means to say, officer, I don't want to answer any questions unless I have a lawyer present. And that question should be preceded by, officer, am I free to go? Because if you're under arrest, you're not free to go. And if you're under arrest, you shouldn't be talking under any circumstances. You know, if he says that you're not being detained, then the next thing should be, well, officer, if I am not free to go, I would like to leave. And I don't want to answer any questions. And if you insist on answering me questions and insist on detaining me, then I'm not answering questions unless and until I have an attorney present. So that's the most important thing I would say to anyone. You know, unless you're the victim of a crime and you have called the police or reached out to the police to aid you and help you, there's no reason to talk to them.
And that's very important. I'm glad you mentioned that. And you know, we just want to thank you for the insight, man. You know, not only from a legal perspective regarding your rights, but also this very complex situation that we have in Minnesota. So we want to thank you. And once again, if you want to reach out to Mr. Josie, his number is 718-301-6814. Okay, and his website is www.thelawofficeofgregoryjosie.com. And we just want to thank you guys for tuning in, and have a blessed weekend. All right.
Thank you very much for having me.